Hey guys, it's Courtney and welcome back. Today I'm creating a scene using the Puddle Jumper stamp set by My Favorite Things. I started off by stamping my image with Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink on a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock cut down to 5.5 by 4.25. I went ahead and masked this little guy out with a full stick Post-it note. And then I'll be doing mirror stamping here because I'm going to be creating a reflection. So I just took a piece of acetate. This is actually a backing of another stamp set. And I'm inking up my stamp and very carefully stamping it on the acetate and then placing that acetate face down on my card base and just pressing that down. The acetate is very slippery, so you have to be careful not only when you stamp, but when you're pressing it on your card base as well. It's not going to give you a very crisp image as if you were to stamp it directly on the cardstock, but that's kind of the look I'm going for here. If you wanted it to have a bolder black outline, you could take a Copic Safe pen and just go over the image. Next, I took a piece of Post-it note tape and just placed that across the card just underneath his feet. And I took an Emboss It pen by Ranger, and I'm just doing little flicks in the background. It's hard to see because it's clear ink. It's kind of like a Versamark ink. And I'm just pressing my pen down and flicking up to kind of make it look like raindrops. I'm not going to be embossing this because I don't want it to completely resist the ink, but you'll still be able to see it in the background. Next, I took Distress ink in the colors Faded Jeans and Broken China. I concentrated my darkest color towards the top of the card base and then worked that down with my Broken China, kind of fading out as I went down. Next, I'll remove my Post-it note tape and place that on the top and mask out the top and basically do the same thing, starting off with my Faded Jeans towards the bottom and working my way back up with the Broken China. Once my masks were removed, I went ahead and started with my Copic coloring. I'm going to be coloring both images. I didn't mask the bottom image because I wanted it to have that blue tint over it because obviously it would be a reflection in water. So I'm starting off with his skin. I'm starting with my lightest color and just mapping out where the darkest areas will be, which will pretty much be underneath his hair for his face and underneath his chin. And I'm just flipping the card base around and doing the same exact thing on the mirror image. Some of the lines are a little difficult to see, especially after adding the Distress ink. So I ended up stamping my image just on my scrap paper back there so I have something to reference rather than flipping the card back and forth every time. Once my darkest color was down, I blended that out a little bit with one of my midtones. And I don't have a particular light source in this case. I'm kind of just keeping it a center light source. I'm not really worried about that. In the end, you won't really even notice. After I went over everything with the lightest color, which is the E50, I took my R20 and just added a little bit of color to his cheeks on both ends and then blended that out again with that E50. Next, moving on to his hair. He doesn't have a part here, so I just concentrated on my darkest areas being on the bottom near his ears and right in the center on top of his head. And I start off, whenever I do hair, I start off with my darkest color because I like to see those little flicks. I don't want it to be too blended. I want still to keep that highlight. In this case, it's not going to have that much of a highlight just because it's raining. There would be no sun, so there's no real major light source where there would be any real reflection. For my lightest color, the E55, I did go over pretty much the entire thing because, like I said, I don't really want too much of a highlight here. For his little rain jacket and his rain boots, I'm doing the same thing. I'm starting off with my lightest color and mapping out my shadows and my darkest areas, which will be underneath his little arms, where he has his leg up. That would create some wrinkles within his raincoat, so that it would be darker there. And where it meets in the middle, where it's either zipped or buttoned, that would also have a shadow there. Once I had my lightest color down, I moved on to my darkest, which is a Y38, but it's more of an orange to me. But once everything is blended out, you won't really see that orange anymore. It'll actually make it look a little shiny, being the material would of a rain jacket would be kind of shiny. So in this case, I had a big contrast between my darkest and my lightest color. Most of the areas that you color should have your 1 or 2 midtones, depending on how many markers you're using. Your darkest color and your lightest color should be very minimal. So I'm bringing that Y38 out with my Y08 and then moving on to my Y02 and bringing most of those areas out to almost the edge. So I'm just leaving just a little bit of room for that highlight color. For his pants, I'm going to be coloring those gray. So I'm using my C markers for this. And I'm starting off with, again, my lightest color. These aren't very big areas, so you could really get away with just 2 colors here. But I wanted them to make it look like a darker gray or a mid-tone gray because I planned on coloring part of his umbrella white. So I wanted to obviously make his pants look gray and that area look white. So I'm bringing out my darkest colors and my midtones a little bit further than I normally would for his pants. Next, for his umbrella and his shirt, which you can't see much of, but I'm coloring those red. So again, I'm starting with my lightest color, which is an R22. It's kind of like a pinkish color. And laying out where my darkest areas will be. When you flip this around, just be careful because it's easy to get those little sections of the umbrella confused. That's why it was helpful to have that little image there in the corner to reference. Next, I went in with my darkest color and just laid just a small amount. This is a really dark color, so I'm just flicking that out just a little bit. And then moving on to my R46, which will actually be the darkest color of his shirt. I did skip the darkest color for his, it was just too small of an area to include that real dark red. Next, for my R24, I flicked that out almost to the edge of the umbrella, just leaving a small highlight and just a small amount of room for that R22. The remaining sections of that umbrella, like I said, I wanted those to appear white. So I could have left it as is, but whenever you're coloring something white, you still will add shadows, especially being there's really no light source here. So it would appear darker, it would not appear white. So I'm going in with my C7 and just adding a tiny bit where the darkest areas will be, then blending that out with my C5, then my C3, and then I'll go to my C1. I will be leaving some of the area white, especially on the top where I had the masked image. So when I flick out my lightest color, I basically just put the marker down, let it sit there for a split second, and flick out very, very lightly with just the tip of the marker so that the edges of the umbrella still remain white. For the little handle of the umbrella, I debated on what color to color this, so I just ended up going in with my C5. And I'm sorry, that was my cat jumping on my desk. I just went in with my C5 to just color that in. I didn't do any shading for that at all. Next, I took my white gel pen and just added a few little reflections in onto the umbrella. Then I noticed a few little areas where I went outside of the lines, being they were so faint, it was easy to do. You can use the colorless blender right over Distress ink. It will not take away the color of the ink itself. I wanted to add little ripples in the water, but for some reason my gel pen just was not showing up. So I used some inexpensive white acrylic paint and just squirted a little bit of that on an acrylic block, watered that down a little bit, and just used a paintbrush to put in those ripples in the water where his 1 foot would be jumping out or jumping into the puddle. Last, I took a sentiment from the Rain or Shine stamp set, also by My Favorite Things, and I stamped my sentiment using VersaFine Onyx Black ink onto the top right corner. I debated on where to put this, but I ended up going directly over the image because I just didn't leave myself enough room for the sentiment. But that's it for today. Thanks so much for stopping by, and I hope you guys have a great day.